All right, in this video, we're gonna talk about what specific products we're treating. Okay, so here let's look at the composition of world trade. As this pie chart shows, the manufacturing goods still dominate today's world trade. About 70% of the goods we trade are actually manufacturers. Okay? We're talking about uh, computers, cars, um, iPhones, um, shoes, clothing, right? All of these. And the second largest part is fuels and mining products. So crude oil, natural gas, precious metals, these are still quite important, okay, as a raw materials for manufacturing sector. Okay. The third one is agricultural products. Okay, accounts for 10% of world trade. So here we're talking about rice, tomato, salmon, right, beef, milk, and so here we find this is I believe the data from like 2017, 2018. Okay, and if we look at the history, we find that there's actually a significant change, especially when we look at the developing countries' exports. Okay, so you find that here we show from late 1950s all the way to early 2000. Okay, and during this historical period, we find that the agricultural products exported from developing countries to the rest of the world declined significantly from about 60% of their total exports all the way down to about 10%, so 50 percentage points decline. Okay? During the same time, their exports of manufacturers to the rest of the world rose substantially, okay, from about 10% all the way up to above 65%. Okay? So again, the trading pattern has changed pretty very much. Okay, in the late 20th century. Okay, the same thing happened actually, among the developed countries. Okay, not just developing ones. So here we look at a pair of developed economies, UK and the US, and specifically focus upon 2 years, 1910 and 2015, and trying to find the difference, okay, or the evolution between these 2 years. Okay, so you find that for UK back in 2010, it exported a lot. As you could imagine, a lot of manufacturer or industrial products made in UK and exported to the rest of the world. Okay, but its imports of the manufacturers is quite small. Okay, 24.5% only. So it's almost 50, yeah, or more than 50% below its exports. In other words, on the import side, UK imported a lot of agricultural and mineral products, okay, like cotton from India, coal, and other raw materials. Okay, but when we look at 2015, we find that on both sides, exports and imports, manufacturing goods dominate. Okay, so they import a lot of manufacturing products at the same time when they export a lot to the rest of the world. Okay, for the U.S., because it became industrialized later, okay, than the UK. So you find back in 1910, the U.S. the U.S. Imported a lot of manufacturing goods, especially from Europe, okay, which accounts for about 60.7%, okay, of imports, and on the export side, only 47.5% made in USA, okay, and exported to the rest of the world. But when we look at 2015, we find that, again, on both sides, manufacturing goods dominate, and the gap between these two become much smaller. Okay, so it's more balanced. From here we could say that the trading pattern, okay, or the share of different products we're trading changed substantially over time. Okay, and in these days, it's definitely the manufacturing goods that dominates the world trade, no matter when we look at developing or developed economies. Okay. All right. Another important thing we want to mention. By the way, you can find much more discussion in the textbook. Okay. I'm not gonna, talk about all of these. I think it's pretty straightforward. So I will just leave you guys, leave these with you guys, like the after class reading assignment. Okay. But there's one more pie chart I want to briefly talk about. It's about service outsourcing. So it's based upon one economic study, which looks at these services. Okay, so that means most of the time you won't find any tangible products, visible products involved in these transactions. Okay, like the haircut we got, right? Like the legal service a law firm can produce or provide, right? So they look at these different types of services and see, what share of the services are actually treatable. Treatable means it could be produced in one country and being sold to another country. Okay, for example, the barber service, the haircut, it's not treatable, right? So the barber and the customer, for most of the time, okay, most of the cases, got to be in the same country, right? I cannot, take a flight to Canada and get my haircut over there and come back for dinner, right? It's most of us, that's impossible. But for let's say an investment bank on Wall Street, they can provide some consulting service to a Japanese firm who is about to go IPO, right? They can do that. A law firm based in Indianapolis can provide the legal service to a Mexican household, let's see, who has a legal dispute with American company, for example, right? So some services are treatable, some services are non-treatable. Okay. So this study looks at different services. They eventually find that 60% of services are non-treatable. In other words, they got to be produced and consumed or sold in the same country. However, 40% of the services are actually treatable. Okay, so you may think, well, 40%, it's still less than half, right? But remember, services combined, all kinds of services together, accounts for about 2/3 of the U.S. GDP. Okay, so it's the largest sector. Okay, way larger than agriculture and manufacture. Okay, so 40% of 2/3 of the U.S. GDP, that's a huge number, right? So a significant portion of the services could be treatable. As I said, the examples I just said, like the legal services, right? The financial services, okay? Again, you can come up with many other examples. And when it comes to international trade, or you and me, our daily lives, there could be a lot of examples or more and more examples. Let's say if you pick up the phone and trying to, contact your credit card company, it's very likely you're going to speak with someone in India, right? So because they have a huge, calling sector or centers in India, taking care of all of these businesses. So the reason we want to talk about this pie chart is because previously we said that manufacturer dominates today's world trade, but when we look at the tradable services, we believe that in the future, sooner or later, these services will become more and more important and eventually dominate the world trade. In other words, the dominance of the manufacturers today is probably just transitional or temporary. Okay. All right. So here we can draw the conclusion for this chapter. I believe it's a very straightforward chapter. Okay. So we start with looking at some interesting facts, okay, about the major trading partners of the United States. Okay. And then we look at the gravity model, okay, and trying to explain, what matters for trade volume between two economies. Okay, we find that size and distance are two important factors. Okay, but at the same time, we also look at when and where the gravity model does not work that well. Okay, look at the exceptions. And finally, in this video, we talk about the changing pattern of world trade. Okay, not just between developed and developing countries, but also between agricultural manufacturers and services. Okay. All right. So this is the second chapter here. Okay, and the next chapter, the third chapter, we're going to look at one model called Ricardian Model. Okay, which talks about the absolute versus comparative advantages. And through that model, we can figure out how trade benefit the economies as a whole. Okay.